Well, brother, I'm always glad to be able to bear witness, even in the grim and dim time, dealing with a U.S. empire that's wrestling with deep spiritual bankruptcy and moral decay. But that still doesn't mean I can't try to tell the truth. The condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak, anybody suffering, but especially poor people, especially working people, especially dominated and occupied people, especially subjugated and degraded people. Their suffering is always at the center. I'm come out of the legacy of Martin King and Fannie Lou Hamer. But at the same time, there are some breakthroughs, and I want to be very honest about that. This is not overly grim and dim. We've got some opposition. We've got some genuine resistance based on remembrance and reverence for something bigger than just predatory capitalist obsession with short-term gain and profit, but tied to something deeper, community, human dignity, human sanctity. So that it's very, very dark times on the one hand, but on the other hand, there's always hope and there's always faith and there's always love. Yeah, what I mean is that Trump and company are gangsterizing America in the sense that notions of honesty, integrity, and decency are pushed to the margin. And at the center is simply domination, transaction, and subjugation. Now, of course, America began as a gangsterized empire vis-a-vis indigenous people with the genocidal attacks and the ugly assaults with enslaved Africans, my own descendants, levels of gangsterization, given the barbarity, of course, of white supremacist slavery, and the rule of bosses at the workplace, predatory capitalist processes that generate asymmetric relations of power at the workplace, and the crushing of trade union movements and what have you. Those were gangsterized movements. But what I'm really talking about is the lack of morality, the lack of spirituality, the lack of integrity, the lack of decency. And that's exactly what we're seeing, not just from the White House, but the social forces behind the White House. I'm talking about Wall Street. I'm talking about Silicon Valley. I'm talking about big military. And I'm certainly talking about, of course, the kind of moral issue of our day, which is the levels of barbarity given the genocide of my precious brothers and sisters in Gaza and the West Bank, my precious Palestinian brothers and sisters. That's really a kind of litmus test of any kind of spiritual and moral health of an empire, of a nation, of a civilization. And the West has failed that test in a colossal way. But I would say even the Arab leaders as well have failed that test. I think world leaders have failed that test. And when historians look back, they will see this genocide, this mass murder of 20,000 precious Palestinian babies and children, and no major attempt to stop it as a sign of the decay and decline of the West. I learned that the American political system is just so thoroughly corrupt, that the two-party system is so thoroughly degenerate, that both parties are tied to big money. They're both tied to Wall Street. They're tied to big military. They're tied to militarism abroad. They're tied to imperial policy. So at the center of my platform, trying to keep alive the legacy of Martin King that always talked about racism, poverty, militarism, and materialism, that I was calling for the abolition of poverty, the abolition of ICE, the vicious repressive apparatus that's been viciously attacking so many immigrants of color in the United States. I call for the breakup of the monopolies in both finance and banking, as well as in industry, the democratizing and the decentralizing and the public control over workplace. I mean, that's part of the real socialist platform. We've got to break up these monopolies in order to get some sense of a distribution of wealth. I live in Manhattan. I'm looking at my precious Harlem community right now, where 25% of those who live in Manhattan are living in utter poverty. 1 out of 24 are millionaires. It's a grotesque wealth inequality inequality. It's just so spiritually vacuous and morally decadent. As I said before, I was calling for the dismantling of the American empire. We do not need 800 military units around the world. We don't need AFRICOM. We don't need all of these various institutional tentacles of the American empire that's obsessed of minerals, oil, resources, and will do anything to the precious people around the world for profit. But it just shows how difficult it is for voices like mine that zero in on poor and working people to have some kind of resonance that translates in a corrupt duopoly, a corrupt two-party political system. Now, don't get me wrong, there were, a good number of people who did support me. Many people supported me that could not vote, as you know, so it's not reflected in the numbers, because if you got 26 write-in and you got 16 states, that's only 42, and you still got 50 states. And even in those write-ins, even when they wrote in, sometimes they weren't even counted. So, I mean, you got a number of obstacles here. But it just shows how difficult it is for the legacy of a Martin King or Fannie Lou Hamer or the great late Edward Said or Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel or Dorothy Day. Those are the figures in my own tradition that I always lift up. And there's just not a massive following for that prophetic tradition in decadent imperial America. Leads me to the conclusion that those of us who are struggling against forms of racism, the thick anti-Palestinian racism in America, even though you've got young people who are more and more struggling against it, the legacy of white supremacy that still is so very thick in the country. You see it when Trump talks about genocide, white farmers in South Africa, where they control a majority of the land and 7% of the population. We can't say a mumbling word about genocide in Gaza. It means, in fact, that predatory capitalism, which is obsessed with short-term profit at any cost, is still very powerful in terms of people willing to consent rather than resist that capitalist mode of production. It shows that it's difficult to get a footing. It is very difficult. I think your question is a very good one, my dear brother, but I don't get discouraged at all, because I don't love poor people. I don't love black people. I don't love Palestinians. I don't love working people. And that's true no matter who they are. It could be Jewish, a Catholic, a Muslim, a Buddhist, a Hindu, a atheistic, or agnostic. I'm committed to being in solidarity with oppressed people, no matter who they are, no matter how unpopular, no matter how limited my footing is, because that is what my calling is. That's what I'm here to do in this world. And I'm going to go down trying to speak those truths and try to live and die for that cause of freedom and justice and truth and beauty. Actually, as you know, music plays a very important role in my sense of who I am. It was a challenge, my brother. It was good for me because I don't have a monopoly on truth. I learned, I listened. I wasn't convinced by their arguments. Their arguments were still very weak. Their analysis, I thought, was weak, and mine was stronger, but I had sustained dialogues, and I tried to stay in contact with their humanity, because I don't think that that fascists, I don't think that authoritarians, I don't think that those who support despotism somehow are devils. They're human beings who are thoroughly misled and misperceive the world. They're human beings who are trying to survive and don't have access to bolder, more moral and spiritual visions of the world. And so I don't put them down as if somehow they are simply manifestations of Satan. They are on a human continuum. It's just many of them are my enemies and my foes because they want to promote policies that crush the people I love. They crush poor people. They crush colonized people and occupied people. They crush working people. And so I do try to sustain some openness to their humanity, even as I acknowledge the gangster-like choices and decisions that they make that pits me over against them.
Well,
Well, as a follower of Jesus of Nazareth, of course, Jesus says, love your neighbor and love your enemy. And what he meant by that is you stay in contact with their humanity and their potential to make choices different than the choices they're making now. And so every human being is made in the image of a loving and a mighty God who has a certain sanctity and dignity. Because, see, my brother, I come from a great black people, man, a great black people. It's hard to find a people who've been hated so chronically and intensely for 400 years and still keep producing love warriors every generation, teaching people the meaning of what love really is. That's John Coltrane's Love Supreme, or Stevie Wonder's Love, Anita Love, or the OJ's Love Train. And justice itself is what love looks like in public. And so there's an intimate connection between love and justice. But any justice that's only justice soon degenerates into something less than justice. That's why the great religious traditions always talk about mercy. They talk about love. That's deeper than justice. They go hand in hand, but it's deeper than justice. The great Islamic tradition talks about mercy at the center. My own Christian tradition talks about mercy and love as well. Judaism talks about justice, but also hesed, loving kindness. It cuts deeper. And that's a way of life. That's not just some kind of isolated belief. That's a way of life for persons like myself. And no matter how popular or unpopular, it doesn't make any difference. I'm going that way. Listening to Holy, Holy, written by a genius named Marvin Gaye, but sang by another genius named Aretha Franklin. It's on the Amazing Grace album of 1972 in the Black Church in Los Angeles. James Cleveland's another genius church in Los Angeles. I'm teaching the great Toni Morrison today in my class. And so we're making that deep connection of Toni Morrison's classic Beloved, Love Warrior again, but thick love, complicated love with Setha and Baby Suggs. And at the same time, that connection with Holy, Holy, WHOLY and HOLY.
I'm sure a few people will be
What a
looking
great
that up.
black people, what a great black tradition, my brother. The Democratic Party is mediocre, it's milquetoast, it's tied to Wall Street, it's tied to Silicon Valley, it's tied to big money. It has some window dressing progressives, but even the progressives themselves know they're on the margins. I think of my dear brother here, who I actually critically supported, brother Soran Kwame Mamdani. And
Newly elected
see,
mayor of New York.
his listen, look, mayor of New York. I thought it's a positive thing, but it's still very, very weak in terms of content. When he gave a speech talking about New York's a city built by immigrants, you say no, that's a settler mentality. You got indigenous peoples whose land was here. You got enslaved Africans whose labor was the economic foundation of the nation, including New York. And those are not voluntary immigrants by any means. And he talks so that he's got this immigrant mentality. And immigrants have made magnificent contributions to the country. Immigrants have made magnificent contributions to the traditions of resistance. But indigenous peoples and black peoples are fundamental peoples in the shaping of the nation too. So that's a settler mentality. And there's a gentrifier sensibility in his campaign in terms of talking about the rent stabilization, which is important and crucial, I support, but it doesn't affect the masses of black and poor people who are locked into projects, public housing. Same is true in terms of the buses and so forth. Affordability doesn't mean as much as people think it really means if you're not talking about wages at the center as opposed to just prices. And so the challenge of someone like my dear brother Zoran is that he's still part of the same mediocre Democratic Party. He calls himself a Democratic Socialist, and I'm a Democratic Socialist, but I call for the breakup of monopolies. I call for the decentralizing. I call for public oversight over monopolies. I call for workers' control in the workplace. I call for taxes on financial transactions of Wall Street. All of those are much more substantive socialist proposals. Now, of course, if he had called for those, he would have maybe got the same number of votes that I did. I can understand that. I can understand that. So I can, understand the kind of compromise he's willing to make. But probably more than anything else, my brother, to keep Jessica Tisch as the police commissioner. Some of us went to jail. My dear brother Carl Dix from Revolutionary Communist Party, and dear brother Jim Fritos, my dear Jewish brother, progressive, who I have great respect for. We all went to jail together, fighting stop and frisk for these vicious police attacks on our youth, black youth, brown youth, poor youth. And the police commissioner stands in that tradition. She was under Eric Adams himself, a black mayor, but as right wing as he could be in terms of his support of repressive policies toward young people. And when my dear brother Zoran said he was keeping Jessica Tisch, whose police department provides the surveillance data for ICE, for the immigration repressive apparatus, to attack immigrants. And you say, well, New York's going to be a sanctuary city, but you got a police commissioner that's providing the surveillance data for ICE to attack the immigrants. And when Trump and the others say, we love the fact that Jessica Tisch is still and will remain police commissioner, and when Wall Street demanded that she remain police commissioner, and when my dear brother Soron said yes, there's no way I can go along with that. No way, not as someone who has any kind of integrity in terms of the Black freedom tradition, in terms of any freedom struggle in New York City. And so in that sense, we have to keep him accountable. The last thing we want is for him to end up as a Muslim version of Barack Obama.
Barack Obama, whom you had originally supported and then became critical.
Exactly right. Just like my dear brother Mamdani. Absolutely. A critical supporter, but it became very clear when Obama brought in Larry Summers, who's been a neoliberal gangster for the last 35, 40 years, as one of his head economic advisors. It was clear with the drones being dropped in Somalia, in Syria, in Pakistan, and Afghanistan. Those are all war crimes. And he's war criminal, just like Bush, just like Biden, just like Trump. And when you see these democratic socialists so willing to cozy up to those kinds of neoliberal Democratic Party leaders, you have to bring serious critique to bear. But of course, we got to wait and see what happens in New York. I'm going to give him time, but I'm not going to give up in my truth telling, as fallible as I am, when it comes to poor people. And the same is going to be true in terms of any oppressed people. It's true in Iran. Should have
Cornel,
more quickly come to the defense of my precious trans siblings, though. That issue didn't surface 50 years ago. If it had surfaced, I would have been much more supportive, but I didn't talk about it hardly at all. Homophobia, I did. Islamophobia, of course, I've been preoccupied with, given the vicious attacks on Muslim brothers and sisters, but I'm critical, of course, of Islamic fascists as well. The four questions that Du Bois himself wrestled with: how does integrity face oppression? And how does decency face insult? How does courage face brute force? And how, in fact, does honesty face deception? Those four questions are set at the very center of my own calling. And I think there's questions that have everything to do with our humanity. I don't care what your religion is. I don't care what your gender. I don't care what your sexual orientation is. It has to do with our humanity. Integrity, honesty, decency, and courage and fortitude. Are you going to be a long distance runner? You're very kind to mention my 50 years. The legacy of the Black Panther Party is still very strong. It runs in my veins. Just lost the great H. Rap Brown and Imam Jamil Abdullah. In fact, you can see his picture right here. Al Humeen, comes out of the legacy of Malcolm X and others. And even as a Christian, he was my deep Muslim brother. We didn't agree on everything, but I loved his fire. I loved his love of Black people. And it's something that I take very, very seriously. And it's something that I'm willing to live for. And it's something that I'm willing to die for.